Never snitched the rule, a lot of y'all forgot to play by.
The story of Jason Calhum begins long before the murder that would eventually send him to prison for life. By the time his name appeared in court records connected to the killing of Shiheem Durham, the violence had already been building for years. It moved through Dover streets, through online threats and retaliations, through rival groups of young men who carried grudges like unfinished business. By the end, one teenager would be dead, multiple families would be destroyed, and prosecutors would describe the killing as something colder than an argument or spontaneous violence. They called it a murder-for-hire scheme. To understand how Shiheem Durham died, you have to begin with the environment surrounding the people involved. Dover is often described as quieter than larger cities nearby, removed from the violence that dominates national headlines. But investigators say neighborhood conflicts had hardened into organized rivalries. Young men moved in groups tied together by loyalty, retaliation, and reputation. Social media intensified everything. Arguments no longer ended when people walked away. They followed each other online, spreading through live streams, posts, messages, and public threats that could be viewed by hundreds within minutes. Police and prosecutors later described a climate where disrespect carried consequences. Insults became confrontations. Confrontations became shootings. Young men grew increasingly focused on image, retaliation, and status. Investigators believed Jason Calhum had become deeply tied to that world. Before the murder case, Calhoun's name was not widely known outside local law enforcement circles. He was one of many young men navigating a life shaped by street alliances, conflict, and growing police attention. Friends and associates moved through overlapping social groups connected to ongoing tensions in Dover. Prosecutors would later argue that these conflicts were not random. They were structured around loyalty and retaliation, with violence becoming a method of enforcing reputation. Shiheem Durham was pulled into that reality. Unlike the larger-than-life figures sometimes portrayed in crime documentaries, Durham was still very young. He was part of a generation growing up in an environment where social disputes could quickly become deadly. Investigators later said the conflicts surrounding Durham and the people connected to him had been escalating for some time before the shooting that ended his life. As tensions increased, law enforcement began monitoring activity tied to rival groups. Detectives examined online exchanges, personal disputes, and associations between people believed to be involved. By the time prosecutors laid out the murder case in court, they described a network of individuals connected not only by friendship, but by coordinated violence. At the center of that violence, prosecutors said, was Jason Calhum. Authorities alleged that Calhum became involved in a plan to kill Shiheem Durham as part of an organized retaliation effort tied to the broader gang conflict. According to investigators, the murder was not spontaneous. It was planned in advance. Prosecutors argued that money and promises of reward were part of the arrangement that led to Durham being targeted. The allegations transformed the case from a standard homicide into something far more serious. Delaware prosecutors described it as a deliberate murder-for-hire conspiracy involving multiple individuals working together. detectives began piecing together communications, witness testimony, and movements leading up to the killing. The murder itself unfolded with terrifying speed. On the day Shiheem Durham was killed, violence arrived suddenly. Gunfire erupted and Durham was struck. By the time emergency responders arrived, the damage was catastrophic. The teenager died from his injuries. Another young life ended in a conflict that prosecutors later argued had been building long before the shots were fired. For Durham's family, the death was immediate and irreversible. One moment, their son was alive. The next, he became the subject of homicide reports, courtroom proceedings, and evidence photographs. The legal system would spend years examining the details of his death. His family would spend those same years living with the absence left behind. As investigators worked the case, attention increasingly focused on Jason Calhum and the people prosecutors believed were connected to the plot. Detectives examined digital communications, relationships between suspects, and evidence they believed showed planning before the killing occurred. Witnesses were interviewed. Search warrants were executed. Prosecutors built a narrative centered around coordination rather than impulse. According to the state, Calhum played a direct role in the conspiracy that led to Durham's murder. Prosecutors argued that the killing was tied to ongoing gang tensions and retaliation connected to disputes between rival groups. In court, the state portrayed the murder as calculated and intentional, carried out for status, loyalty, and payment. The arrest marked a turning point. What had once been another deadly street shooting evolved into a high-profile prosecution centered on conspiracy and organized retaliation. Law enforcement publicly emphasized the seriousness of the allegations, describing the case as evidence of how gang conflicts were evolving inside Delaware communities. For investigators, the case represented more than a single homicide. It reflected a broader pattern they believed was growing more dangerous. Younger individuals becoming involved in increasingly organized violence tied to neighborhood disputes and social media-fueled retaliation. Detectives and prosecutors warned that these conflicts no longer stayed contained between individuals. Entire groups became involved. Violence spread outward. As the case moved toward trial, the courtroom became the next battleground. Prosecutors presented evidence intended to show planning, coordination, and motive. Witness testimony, communications, and investigative findings were laid out piece by piece. The state argued that Jason Calhum knowingly participated in a murder-for-hire plot that ended Shiheem Durham's life. Defense attorneys challenged aspects of the prosecution's case, forcing jurors to examine credibility, intent, and the reliability of witnesses connected to the investigation. Like many gang-related homicide prosecutions, the case involved overlapping loyalties, competing narratives, and individuals whose lives were already deeply entangled with violence and the criminal justice system. But prosecutors maintained that the evidence formed a clear picture. They argued that Durham had been deliberately targeted and that Calhum's role was not accidental or peripheral. According to the state, this was coordinated violence carried out with intent. As testimony continued, the emotional weight of the case became impossible to separate from the legal arguments. Family members sat through descriptions of the shooting and the investigation. Courtrooms often reduce lives to evidence and procedure, but beneath every exhibit and witness statement remained the reality that a teenager had been killed, and multiple families were now tied forever to the outcome. The trial also exposed the broader atmosphere surrounding the violence. Prosecutors described rivalries fueled by retaliation and online conflict. Investigators explained how disputes escalated publicly through social media before turning deadly in real life. The courtroom became not only a place to determine guilt, but a place where the culture surrounding the violence was dissected in front of jurors. When verdicts and sentences finally came, the consequences were severe. Jason Calhum was sentenced to life in prison for his role in the murder of Shiheem Durham. Another defendant also received a life sentence. Prosecutors described the outcome as justice for a deliberate killing carried out through conspiracy and retaliation. At sentencing, the state emphasized the calculated nature of the crime. Prosecutors argued that Durham's murder reflected a willingness to treat human life as expendable within the logic of gang conflict and revenge. The court imposed punishment accordingly. For Durham's family, the sentencing did not erase what happened. Court rulings cannot restore a lost son. They cannot return years erased by gun violence. Like many families impacted by homicide, they left the courtroom carrying the same grief that existed before the trial began. For Jason Calhum, the sentencing closed one chapter and opened another. His life shifted permanently from the streets and conflicts that shaped the case to the rigid structure of prison. The alliances, disputes, and retaliations that prosecutors said fueled the murder ultimately led to a sentence that will likely define the remainder of his life.